Then you burst into fire. Forever.
Hello.
Hello.
You're listening to The Full Blossom of the Evening, a podcast about David Lynch and Twin Peaks.
I'm Indigo.
I'm Hilary.
And I'm John.
Listeners, we're going to tell it to you, and we're going to tell it to you straight. Today, we're talking about
Psychic self-defense.
And I saw her glowing. I saw her smiling. I feel like I'm gonna dream tonight.
Listeners, did you hear a third voice on our introduction today? That's because we have our first ever guest on The Full Blossom of the Evening, and that's our dear friend, John Bernardy. Hello, John.
Hi,
Hello.
John.
Thanks for having me on. I have been a fan of yours since, since before you started, technically. But, once I heard your first couple episodes, I'm like, oh, I'm in. Like it's so good.
Oh, well, you were probably our first fan and our biggest fan for a long
Yeah.
time. And so we couldn't imagine a better first guest to have on this show.
And the feeling is very mutual. We really admire your work as well, and I think that probably our podcast wouldn't exist if yours didn't, if we're being honest.
Oh,
That is 100% true. Listeners, if you're fans of our little podcast, you have definitely heard of John Bernardy, but we're going to still give him an opportunity to introduce himself and talk about his show a little bit.
all right. Well, yeah, I'm officially the host of the Blue Rose Task Force podcast. It's been going since about 2022. But I've been a fan of the show since it was originally airing. I was 12 at the time, and Twin Peaks has kind of hit me at that exact right age to make me a lifelong fan, and I finally jumped into the ring after a little while. But I've written for 25 Years Later site while The Return was airing, and so I've been listening to Twin Peaks podcast for forever, and I figured out that the thing that I could really add that a lot of people haven't is, I can go back and add in production history. I can talk in full spoiler terms, which is everything from the people making Twin Peaks all the way through, like, what happened in part 8 and the final dossier, and like I'm basically going through one element at a time. And currently I'm in the middle of Fire Walk with Me, and if we play our cards if we play our cards right, you're gonna hear Hilary on my show on the very same day this releases, Twin Peaks Day, because we're gonna release the Women Speak About Fire Walk with Me episode on that day. So yeah, come on over. It'll be fun.
So exciting.
And yes, our intent is to release this episode on Twin Peaks Day this year. So we're just so thrilled that you're here. This is a wonderful event. And being on Blue Rose Task Force myself, a dream come true.
Aw.
I'm not exaggerating. So, well, today we're talking about this book, Psychic Self-Defense by Dion Fortune. And why are we talking about it? What's its relevance to Twin Peaks?
Well, it came from Mark Frost. Like, I know we're supposed to be focusing on David Lynch, but
David Lynch
main,
and Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
his main collaborator knew about this book. Mark Frost. He listened to Coast to Coast AM with Art Bell for years and everything. So like he's like into the whole alien kind of stuff. If you've read Secret History of Twin Peaks, like it's very clear that like he has an interest in this esoteric kind of stuff, and that's that explains how we get things like all these psychic kind of characters, and the supernatural that is flavored the way it is in Twin Peaks. And he got a lot of that stuff, including terms like White Lodge and Black Lodge, from
Mhm.
this very book. That I mean, it was written back in 1930, but it's been a favorite of everybody in the occult circles for ever since it was written, basically. And it definitely found its way to Mark Frost, and then he gave it to people like Harley Payton and Robert Engels, who were like producers on the show. And Robert Engels co-wrote the Fire Walk with Me movie with David Lynch and
Yeah.
everything. So like all the people who have like dug into it and read enough of it to like drop in little nuggets in Twin Peaks. Yeah, this was a long time coming for me, because I have never read this book until this podcast. Like, this is a perfect opportunity. The way that, it's like I do Blue Rose Task Force, where I look into like every little bit of minutia of Twin Peaks under the microscope. And then like you do a telescope out and do the same exact thing looking outward. So like, like that, I
It's a perfect collaboration topic for
exactly.
us, really. It's like where both of our approaches kind of meet is
Mm-hmm.
right here with psychic
Yes,
self-defense.
Yeah.
Um,
absolutely.
yeah, I was surprised to learn that David Bowie loved this book as well,
Right.
and that he was briefly obsessed with it, I think in the 1970s, and carried it around with him everywhere, and actually believed that he was under psychic attack and saw this as a useful tool. So it
Okay.
was swirling around Twin
Mm-hmm.
Peaks, David Lynch. And so even if Lynch
Yeah.
didn't read it himself,
Yeah.
he was certainly exposed to the ideas in this book.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was something we had talked about, I know, was just like there's no way that it wasn't coming up in conversation, at least. Like I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure there were times where like like Mark Frost or David Bowie or some other friend or something was like, "Oh, have you," like, especially because it was so popular. It's like there's
Yeah.
no way that people weren't sharing these ideas with David, and I can totally see him sort of taking it in and it coming
Mm-hmm.
through in his work. And because even I know earlier, was that today or yesterday, John, you had mentioned you even see it in some of his other films as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those were really good points too. I think it's definitely got its hands in all of his work.
Yeah.
Though today we're going to confine our discussion mostly to Twin Peaks.
Yes.
So
Because otherwise we would be here for 5 hours, I think, or more. Who knows?
And so we should probably also mention that our intent is to have a follow-up episode on your show, right, John? On
Yes,
Blue Rose Task
absolutely.
Force, where we
Yep.
have a kind of sequel to this one on psychic
Yeah.
self-defense. So we don't have to cover everything this time.
Yes.
So I'm going to start with just a really quick bio of Dion Fortune, the author of this book. She was born in 1890, Violet Mary Firth, and her pseudonym, her pen name, comes from her family motto, which was Deo non fortuna, so God, not luck. And so that's where she got the name Dion Fortune. She was raised by a Christian Scientist, her mother, and she studied psychology and horticulture. In psychology, she studied Freud, then Jung, whom she ultimately preferred. So maybe there's a little bit of a Mark Frost connection, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Dion Fortune approached occultism as a skeptic, but personal experiences that she had finally convinced her of its validity. According to Gareth Knight, the author of Dion Fortune and the Inner Light, quote, she began by trying to explain occultism in terms of psychology, but ended by having to explain psychology in terms of occultism. Throughout her career, she really hoped for and strove for a meaningful dialogue between both fields. She thought that occultism and psychology could work together and enhance each other in that cooperation. She joined the Theosophical Society in 1924 and later formed her own organization, the Fraternity of Inner Light. It's still in existence. Now it is known as the Society of Inner Light.
And in addition to all that, she also had time where she's at least associated with the Golden Dawn and Freemasonry. So like she's got like all the Twin Peaks food groups right now. And she had it before she wrote this book from my understanding.
So, to give a quick overview of the book, also it'll depend on which version you have. I think we were all reading the version with the foreword by Mary K. Greer, which I really appreciated because there was a sort of beginning foreword, an explanatory note talking about how. To be very straightforward listeners, this book has not aged super well. There are definitely some questionable parts where there's racism and prejudice to different groups of people. So I really appreciated that sort of explanatory note, that foreword, to say, all right, we can still try to appreciate some of what's going on here in this book, but also recognize that we don't agree with these things anymore.
Right.
So I just wanted to mention that I think that this was a good version to have because of that. So then diving into the book itself, it's broken into 4 separate parts. And so part 1 is types of psychic attack. It goes through signs of psychic attack, analysis of the nature of psychic attack, a case of modern witchcraft, projection of the etheric body, vampirism, hauntings, the pathology of non human contacts, the risk of incidental to ceremonial magic. And then in part 2, we go over differential diagnosis. So that covers sort of the distinction between objective psychic attack and subjective psychic disturbance, non occult dangers of the Black Lodge, the psychic element in mental disturbance. And then in part 3, we go over the diagnosis of psychic attack. So methods employed in making a psychic attack, and then the motives of psychic attack. And then part 4, we wrap up with methods of defense against psychic attack. So the physical aspect of psychic attack and defense, diagnosis of the nature of an attack, and then methods of defense.
So, John, you made some awesome notes on the general historical context of this text.
Yeah, trying to trying to at least get to the understanding of like what all the blatant racism is in this book, because I mean there's a lot of it, but I mean if you think about it, okay, think back to 1990 Twin Peaks. It's like you've got Tojimura. It's like the casual racism of the day, it just wasn't thought about. It was just understood. Like there were things that, just culturally speaking, it was just there, and it's not meant to be malicious. It just, is by ignorance.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of that in here. I mean, from, for Fortune being Welsh, we've got a thing going on around that time in Britain, in particular. They're noting, Gandhi was protesting the British salt monopoly. So that would have been a big thing, and the nation of India would be seen as an adversary at the time, which is why there's a lot of that in this book. And eugenics itself was like a huge, validly discussed topic since like at least the early 1900s. And I mean this book was published in 1930, and of course that led into things like World War II, and Hitler gets elected 3 years after this book was published. So that explains random notes about the level of Jewishness or whatever. Like I mean there's a lot of nonsense in this book, but I mean it's the kind of thing that it was just there, and you had to speak through it if you're part of that culture. And I mean if you think about it, 12 years after this is when the Japanese internment camps happen in the US and everything. So like it's just that kind of thing. And I don't know, like I'm not excusing it, but if you understand it, at least you can kind of ask, or you can at least sort of half answer, it's like, why this forward thinking book about um, psychic attack and, defending yourself against, bad energy has all this bad energy in
Yeah.
That's a great point.
it.
I
Yeah.
know my margins are littered with um, kind of horrified emoji faces, and
Yeah.
Yeah.
sometimes I just wrote "girl" dot dot dot.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
yeah. So I kind of reminded myself of which passages I didn't want to revisit. Yeah.
Yep. But I will also say that, but besides all the over racism, I do see a lot of forward thinking, in terms of,
Hmm.
power imbalance. Like, there's a lot of that stuff in there, like where,
Right.
but I mean, Dion Fortune, she's a woman, she had to
Hmm.
deal with sexism from the other end of who has the power. So, like, of course, she's going to get kind of a leg up on that sort of thing and be, um, it's, I mean, she's a white woman, so, like, she doesn't notice
Right.
the racism, but she does notice how women are treated, and it,
Hmm.
it, it comes out like she sounds like a spitfire.
Definitely. This was this was our first experience with this book.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So what are our general takes on it before we get into its connections to Twin Peaks? Just how did you respond to it? Okay, I was going to say, did you enjoy it? But we've already talked, and I know that none of us objectively enjoyed this book.
Yeah, I would say that while I didn't necessarily enjoy it, I'm coming to it from the experience of growing up in a household that was like where witchcraft was very prevalent, and then being involved in different witchcraft communities over the years in a variety of ways. So I've read a lot of texts that are similar to this sort of, or like, along the same sort of subjects. So a lot of the basic ideas that she shares are ones that were already sort of familiar to me.
Hmm.
A lot of the things that she says about psychic attacks or like hauntings or things like that are ideas that I've been reading in other books for years now. I think that in those ways, it's a very straightforward, sort of accessible text, I think, which is probably lends to why it was so popular. Honestly, I almost wish that it was more that, and then less that it was like, she would start to say something interesting, kind of, and then she would be like, oh my God, it reminds me of this one time that my friend, like, this happened to her. Like, it was like she would get off on these tangents like every, and I
Hmm.
know that it was to sort of give examples, but they came across very much as like just being like, oh yeah, me and my famous friends and stuff,
Hmm.
like, like name dropping almost, except
Yeah.
she wasn't dropping names. It felt like she was really trying to play up how cool she thinks she is, kind of, which made it kind of hard to read, because I'd be like, oh good grief. And then she would say something racist, or or
Hmm.
she did an interesting thing, I think, where she would flop back and forth about a lot of things. I felt like she would describe things that, like, she would be describing things that are recognized as like witchcraft, but then she would be like talking smack about people who practice witchcraft,
Hmm.
which I thought was really interesting. Like, she would kind of talk about things being like almost like too woo woo, or rather that, like, like people are like, silly or bad or something. But then she's like, but like, I manifested a werewolf one time. I
Yeah.
created a werewolf one time. And I was like, all right, lady. Okay. She's
Hmm.
like, but witches are bad and stupid. And I was like, okay. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But again, like, I mean, there were totally things that I underlined that I thought were kind of interesting or useful passages. I think that like the foreword by Mary Greer, I think was helpful because I
Yeah.
think she put it well to say that like there are things that you can totally pull from this book that are useful or interesting. It's like still kind of worth reading, I would say. If you're really into it and you really want to do it, I think it's worth it. Was it a slog to get through at times? Oh yeah.
Well, first of all, I think your perspective as someone who grew up in those communities and is still an active member of witchcraft circles and such, it's wonderful, right? Because you've got
Yeah.
that insider perspective. Part of
Hmm.
me listening to you describe that, I was wondering how much of what's now common knowledge kind of
Yeah.
came from this book because it
Yeah.
was so
Hmm.
popular, and how much of it was already common knowledge when Dion Fortune was writing it. I
Right.
don't have an answer to that. I'm not sure. Do
No,
any of
and
Yeah.
that's something that I had definitely thought about too while reading it, just because of the timeline and everything, is that these topics or ideas that she's talking about have become like extremely mainstream. And
Mhm.
like at the time when this came out, it's very possible and very realistic that like she was maybe, if not like the first person to be talking about them, maybe the first to put them into books.
Hmm.
So
Well, in the book, I found the book difficult to read because it was so dry,
yeah,
and so kind of technical. But in some ways, that makes it more useful, I guess, for what she intends it to be, which is almost like a handbook for
Hmm.
diagnosing
right.
and then defending yourself against psychic attacks, which she believes are just
Hmm.
everywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
And I like that she kind of avoids the Crowley-esque drama, you know?
Yeah.
Hmm.
And she's really just aiming for this practical guide that also is very credible. You can tell that she's trying to take a scientific approach and
Yes,
sell
definitely.
this to us as a kind of science. Even those anecdotes that you spoke of were weirdly free of dramatization. So
Yeah.
you would just say, "Oh, she manifested a wolf." Okay. We're like,
Hmm.
"That's
Yeah.
she didn't over
Yeah.
she didn't do much with her language to dramatize things like that."
No, it was very casual. She was like, and then I was feeling a lot of
Hmm.
rage, and I
Yes.
was thinking about Fenris, and then the next thing, there was a wolf
Hmm.
next to me.
I have to say that once in a while I had to dip into other theosophical texts in order to try to find more information about things that she was just kind of mentioning casually and then moving on
Hmm.
from.
I did
And
underline a lot of stuff to look up later.
yeah, but I thought that those texts were much more difficult to read. So
uh,
when I ventured outside of psychic self defense, I think I came to a better appreciation for probably what made it so popular is how
Hmm.
straightforward it was, how kind of simple it was for a layman to pick
Yeah.
up and read, unlike some of the other things that are still out there, in the Internet Archive.
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. How about you, John? What was your take on the book just as a reader?
Well, just in general, I mean, I come from the Twin Peaks side of things. So,
Mhm.
like, like I'm just looking for the connections that are definitely there to be had.
Yeah.
Um, like when it got into her stories about things like, well, I mean, Fenris, like that made me think automatically, yeah, it's like, yeah, she's definitely a Jungian because
Mhm.
like Jungians basically, um, they do dream analysis and things like that, and it's like everything's an archetype. It's like
Uh,
she had a massive disagreement with someone and wanted revenge, and it's like what comes up, the Norse god wolf thing. It's like
right.
it takes the shape of that. So like and from that point of view, it's like, oh yeah, okay, so this is some Jungian stuff sneaking in and everything. So like I didn't um I didn't necessarily catch on to um too much, other than I also thought, it's like, well, I mean, this is also a fiction writer who, if you're Jungian and you want to do all these storytelling aspects, it's like, tell a story.
Yeah.
So, like, I don't really have an idea one way or the other if, like, she's actually genuine about this stuff or not.
Huh.
Mhm.
But the way you were talking about it, Indigo, it made me think that, like, while simultaneously it being kind of like the Citizen Kane after having watched everything that was influenced by the things that were influenced by Citizen
Ah.
Kane,
Uh,
like, I also got the distinct impression that, like, she and her friends are basically like amateur unedited bloggers of the
Ah.
day.
yeah.
And
I could see that.
it's like
Oh
she
my
she just
gosh.
writes down what happened, and she's just putting it out there and not really thinking too much about it. She just wants to get this out there, and she's gonna tell it the way she tells it.
Yeah, I
And
want to see her Substack.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But it's like you get a little bit of her day to day while she's giving you the recipes. Yeah,
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's like when you go to like a recipe on Pinterest and then you have to
yeah,
like scroll through like, my grandma made this once when I was 12 and I looked
hmm
for the recipe
yeah,
and then you
exactly.
then you get to the here's the actual recipe and the
Yeah,
recipe's how to protect yourself from a psychic attack.
yes.
I really like that. I like that.
So here's a quick overview of how we're going to approach analyzing this book's relationship to Twin Peaks. We've sorted the topics into two categories. So the first are some straightforward details that are really interesting to note that might shed some new light on certain characters or situations in Twin Peaks, or they might just be fun to observe. But we can address these more quickly or efficiently than some of the others because we've also got these broader areas of comparison that we've found open some questions and maybe some new readings of major plot points and characters. So we've got, straightforward details and then these broader areas that we're going to address today. The first, I think, and most obvious of the straightforward details is that this is the source for the names, the Black Lodge and the White Lodge.
Right.
But she's not talking about them as spiritual places. She's talking about them as occult groups. So in psychic self defense, these Black Lodges and White Lodges are mostly human occult organizations. The Black Lodges seem just as likely to use blackmail as they are black magic.
hmm
She has a
Mm.
long chapter about the non occult dangers of the Black Lodges. There is this idea of the ascended masters of the Great White Lodge in Theosophy, and that refers to figures like Jesus, Confucius, Buddha, and so on. So there is this, I guess, counterpart in the astral realm or a spiritual realm of the White Lodge, but it's not clear that that exists in terms of the Black Lodge in this text.
You're definitely right that the Black Lodge is definitely more like people trying to accumulate all this power and stuff. It's more
Mhm.
like Wyndham Earls than Bob's. Um,
Yeah.
but, like, there's all this power that it doesn't come from nowhere. Like, the Fortune does start kind of talking about how it manifests itself. Like, maybe not
Mhm.
exactly the source of where it comes from, but like what it ends up uh, taking the shape of.
Yeah, we see a lot of context for just the general sense of the power of Twin Peaks. The something dark that's in those woods feels analogous to some of the things that Dion Fortune's talking about. She says early on in the book that we live in the midst of invisible forces whose effects alone we perceive. We move among invisible forms whose actions we very often do not perceive at all, though we may be profoundly affected by them. So the idea that we as humans are always moving among these kind of spiritual entities or astral entities.
Mhm.
Yeah, and Fortune uses the ocean as a metaphor for the world of the unseen. So some people are specifically trained as divers in it, but sometimes it also floods the land. Normally, this does not occur. We are protected by our very incapacity to perceive these invisible forces. There are four conditions, however, in which the veil may be rent and we may meet the unseen, she writes. And the conditions are: we may find ourselves in a place where these forces are concentrated. We may meet people who are handling these forces. We may ourselves go out and meet the unseen, led by our interest in it, and we get out of our depth before we know where we are. We may fall victim to certain pathological conditions which rend the veil. So the idea that the place can
Mhm.
also be a concentration of these forces rather than just like a person putting a psychic attack on you, but a place as well can sort of manifest that, is something that we totally see with Twin Peaks. We've talked on previous episodes about that sort of energy that comes like just crawling and creeping out from the Black
Mm-hmm.
Lodge into the Twin Peaks, and how it starts to take over, and how we see Twin Peaks in The Return when that's unchecked, and how it's affected the people there. And so we can see this example of this sort of like psychic damage done by a place here in Twin Peaks as well.
That's the one that I had highlighted as probably the most relevant to Twin Peaks,
Yeah.
is the place, right? Um,
Yeah.
but did any of you see any of those other four as relevant?
I mean, I think that definitely there are characters that we see for sure handling those forces.
How would you categorize the log lady?
Okay, yeah. So do we think that the log lady is affected by
Hmm.
place, or is she herself a person who handles the forces?
I mean, in a way, she's handling the forces by speaking through, like, by being an interpreter of the log, which is
Hmm.
attached to the place because it's a natural element.
Yeah, I mean, the log is definitely a conduit.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I mean, if the telephone pole in Fire Walk with Me is any indication, like wood definitely um, is conductive of certain energies. And I know in Twin Peaks, like the energies are a
Hmm.
little bit um, different than just, things that need insulated cables. So, yeah, I think you could almost say, like, Margaret's tending a portal.
Yeah. Oh, I love that way that you said that.
It's interesting though because she doesn't seem like a character who actively goes out and seeks a connection with the unseen so much as she just is one
Hmm.
and has accepted this role.
Yeah.
Right.
Where I feel as though even when we see Cooper throwing rocks and using kind of Tibetan magic, or certainly Wyndham Earl,
Yeah.
these are people who are actively opening themselves to what Fortune calls the unseen. Well, I'm not sure my feeling on what Margaret does. I don't know.
I mean, yeah, I would say like Cooper is very much could fall into that third category of going out to meet the unseen, led by our interest in it, and then get out of our depth before we know where we are. I could totally see Cooper falling into that category.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot of that in this book. I mean, there's just I mean, this is where the term magician comes from too. And I
Mhm.
mean,
Yeah.
obviously magician is a older an older word than this book, but the way it's used, the
Right.
magician longs to see, that kind of magician. Um
Right.
definitely seems related to this stuff. I mean, I know Lynch came up with that kind of on his own, but I have a feeling it was probably after talking with Frost about a few things, and I'm sure Frost, put a couple of concepts in his ear about, like how we could do things, supernaturally.
Right.
But yeah, I mean the concept of magician, like it's used in this book, the black hat kind of Black Lodge, um, psychic attacking, psychic attackers, that kind
Yeah.
of thing. Like, I mean, that kind of magician is what we're going to eventually see with Mr. C, you know? And
Yeah.
I love that at the very beginning of this book, like the first sort of like fictionalized account kind of thing that you could say is in here is like there's a Mr. C and a
Yeah.
Mrs. C, and Mrs. C just seems like the Sarah Palmer of the couple, where like
Yeah.
she's like in the line of the fire, but like not necessarily so, and then the Mr. C here seems like he could be possessed by an entity, or he could be one of these like evil mind controlled type. Like this is back, this is like in the early sections where they're talking about like hypnotism and mind control kind of things.
Mhm.
But I love that Mr. C is in there, and I would not be surprised at all if that's why they call Mr. C that one time in
Mm.
Otis's shack.
Well, that's really fun to think that that might come from psychic self-defense too.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And then we see characters like that, like toward the end, like one of the in the actual psychic attack like the defense against sections, like at the end. There's one that really vibes with like Mr. C being like that kind of a presence
Uh,
where like, he's exuding his personality over the people around him, and like he's just
Mhm.
causing trouble to everybody,
right.
including Dion Fortune's crowd. And
Mhm.
like they
Yeah.
come together against him, against this one particular Mr. Z guy,
Yeah.
um, toward the end. And that reminds me of Mr. C, but I'm saying it now because that's kind of like what happens to Dale after he
Right.
gets in too far. So
Yeah.
like, he starts out in this one way, but then like, he goes deeper into this stuff, and he's not really defending himself against anything, and
Right.
he ends up kind of becoming this he becomes the attacker rather than the defender.
Well, there were some things that Dion Fortune said that made me think of Cooper, where she said, quote, "A man whose consciousness has been exalted by ritual and who does not know how to seal his aura and return to normal life
Mhm.
is liable to psychic invasion."
Uh,
And, in her terms, that sealing of the aura is what would prevent you from being possessed or attacked. And so when we see him at the end of the original series, split and a doppelganger who's somehow
Mhm.
with Bob, possessed by Bob or with Bob, that's clearly a pierced aura in Dion
Yeah.
Fortune's terms. So he's been exalted by ritual. We've seen him dabble in magic, but he
right.
has failed to protect himself.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's, coming from a witchcraft standpoint, it's like any time that you are going to be dabbling in something where, you're opening yourself to darker energies, or just the unknown. It doesn't even, you may not know that it's, darker. You need to cleanse your space and yourself and put protections in place. And I think that something we've talked about Cooper in past episodes is that curiosity and ego of being just, he
Mhm.
just wants to dive in, but is he a diver? This way that Fortune talks about divers that are specially trained. I think that he thinks that he's a diver, but he may not be, and he is in some ways for sure. I think that there are totally situations where he is obviously well more prepared than other people in Twin Peaks,
Mhm.
but that doesn't necessarily mean that he is, above it all. Like there are
Yeah.
things that can still drown him.
Well, Fortune makes a point that it's very seldom that the unseen comes in search of human beings.
Yeah.
But if we seek it out, it will happily return the
Mhm.
call and join us. And she says that the subjective self has only the kindling, the cosmos supplies the fuel. So once we go searching, the fire begins. And in a phrase that I thought sounded so resonant with Twin Peaks, she said, "Once the fire is started, the cosmic forces of the appropriate type will stoke it." Doesn't that
Which could
just sound?
truly,
That
Yeah,
sounds
that
like
could
the
just
log
be a
lady.
line.
Yep.
Yeah.
When this kind of fire starts, it is very hard to put out. The
Yep.
tender
Yeah.
boughs of innocence burn first, and the wind rises, and then all of goodness is in jeopardy. From
No,
Yeah.
that
Fire
could
Walk with Me. Yeah.
right. No, that completely aligns with uh all of the ideas that we hear in Twin Peaks, I think.
Well, speaking of place, Fortune goes on quite a bit about what she calls the oversoul of a geographic place. And she cites forests in particular as having this kind of oversoul. She says that people who come into touch with the unseen through the influence of places might not actually be psychic, but if you're sufficiently sensitive to perceive invisible forces subconsciously, you can go to a place where they're concentrated at high tension and you can experience them. That sounds so much like Ghostwood, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, she actually says, and this is a quote, any organic geographical unit develops something of an oversoul, and where the differentiation is marked, the oversoul may become a very definite entity. If there are among the inhabitants of a district any who are sensitive to the unseen, they may form either an affinity or a repulsion for this oversoul. A great forest has a very marked personality, and there are few white men who can resist its influence, becoming markedly changed and dehumanized if exposed to it for long periods without the companionship of others of their race. Okay. She does go on to say that natives are not affected by it. Um, but still, I had to make the note that, like, Jerry Horn, right? He spends all that time out in the woods and perhaps is deranged and dehumanized by the
Yeah.
experience. So,
Yeah.
yeah. But that was just a silly note. Still, I think we do see this sense that the forest of Twin Peaks, Ghostwood, is a uniquely powerful entity.
No, it absolutely is. Even right from the get-go, we have Cooper driving in, these fantastic trees, got to find out what these trees are. He is already fascinated by the woods. And then again, there's so many particular important scenes and actions that
Sure.
happen in the woods.
Hmm.
It is definitely a crucial setting of Twin Peaks.
Yep.
Well, another straightforward detail that we see here are what Fortune calls the quote, occult police force and hunting lodges.
The metaphor that I kind of equate it with is less about, the FBI versus the Wyndham Earls and more like, hackers. You've got the white hats and the black hats. And, the white hats are just kind of like patrolling their own and making sure that, hubris and, um, hypnotism and all that stuff is under control.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that, like there's one of those stories that Fortune recounts where like she's being initiated into an order, and the initiator or the head of that organization like tries to attack her psychically over a couple nights, like while she's dreaming.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
she hears this one voice basically telling her to, like no, or like stay strong, essentially. Like I'm just paraphrasing, but
Right.
like she'd hear these voices come in, and I was hoping that this would be like the giant coming in, saying like
Mm-hmm.
it is happening
Ah.
again, like one of those kind of voices. But it turns out that it's like one of one of her acquaintances. Like she talked to her like a couple days or weeks later, and she found out that like they were basically doing an intervention to kind of like counteract the attacker.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And like that's the kind of psychic police force we're dealing with here.
She did say some things about that occult police force that did remind me of the giant. She said that others may know it by different names, but I believe it to be a very real and concrete thing, though its organization is not upon the physical plane, nor, so far as I know, are its mundane activities gathered up into any single pair of hands. So it's like this inner voice and circumstances direct our activities when we cooperate with this mysterious organization. And she thinks that it's mostly involved with occult methods applied to criminal ends and offenses against society. So it's there to kind of counteract those. But
Mhm.
I didn't get I know that in that one story, she was, it did involve a friend or an acquaintance of hers, but there does seem to be this involvement from another plane of the
Mhm.
occult police force. And then on the physical plane, she talks about these hunting lodges, um, who are organized in conjunction with the occult police, and that they seem to be a human organization who's there to kind of act out the plans of the occult police that exist on this astral plane. All of that made me think of the occult police force then as the equivalent of like the giant Philip Gerard in The Return. And then the hunting lodges are the equivalent of like the Bookhouse Boys or the Blue Rose Task Force. They're the human entities, the human
Uh,
organizations that are then doing this work.
Yeah, that sounds right to me, especially the way that it manifested in the original series.
Mhm.
Because I mean, the first 30 episodes, like the only thing you see is the people on the ground with like random moments of these supernatural creatures.
Mm.
right, right. And it's really mostly as you get further into the show that it becomes a lot more paranormal and supernatural.
Yeah, yeah.
So, another sort of straightforward comparison we saw was the idea of watchers. So, watches are formed in a specific way. A high grade operator connecting telepathically with a person can formulate an astral animal at the end of a shining cord of the magnetic link, to which he transfers a modicum of his own consciousness. This animal form is called a watcher. It does not act on its own initiative unless attacked. The use of a watcher is to obtain a record of what is transpiring without the necessity of focusing consciousness thereon. When the psychic substance of the watcher is reabsorbed by the adept, he becomes aware of the content of the watcher's consciousness. This is something that uh, you see throughout. Like with witchcraft and stuff. I think that this would be often seen as like even like a familiar is sort of like a
Mm.
part of you. But there's also like if we get into sort of a fantasy element, you see stuff like this all the time in like fantasy books or, like even like tabletop games. And so I think it's a pretty common concept. And I think definitely in Twin Peaks, we see it with the owls for sure. And also potentially with the white horse. I think especially because there's so much focus on like the owls are not what they seem, the sort of paranoia that goes along with that. Think they could absolutely be seen as watchers. It's this idea of someone putting out something that's basically appearing as an animal or can to sort of spy for them basically.
Mhm.
Mhm.
But it's this entity that they've made in an astral way.
I get the impression of these these observers kind of fitting into this thing that especially surfaced in The Return, where it seems like there's like an observer effect sort of situation. Like you almost have to have somebody seeing what's happening to anchor something into becoming official or something. Like even even when Ed and Norma finally get together in part 15 of The Return, the scene ends with Shelley looking on them.
Mhm.
Like there's always something about that. And Lucy's talking about how it's like, how does the thermostat work if nobody's around to look at it? It's like
Yeah.
it's all over in so many different ways that like it totally has to be a thing for at least 2017 Twin Peaks. But
Mhm.
I don't know if all the owls watching or the horse watching over Sarah, like if that officially counts in that way or not. It's like, do the forces have to observe something in order for it to proceed?
That's such an interesting question, and I was just thinking about how in our last episode comparing Lynch to Tati, we talked about how Lynch's camera is often a presence, right?
Yeah.
Like just there is an element of like the watcher
Mm-hmm.
even in his camera. So for example, when we're watching Dr. Jacoby unload his shovels
Mm-hmm.
from that distance that just kind of moves a little bit behind a tree, we don't feel that he's alone out there
Right.
at
Yeah.
all, that the camera is the eye of
Mm-hmm.
a watcher, an observer, maybe not a
Yeah.
watcher in Dion Fortune's sense, but yeah, you never get the feeling that characters are alone and unobserved.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then in the dream sequence in Fire Walk with Me, I mean, Cooper addresses the camera, "Don't take the ring, Laura." So the camera is Laura
Mhm.
in that case.
It is interesting to think, though, if the owls were intended to be watchers in the Dion Fortune sense of the term, that they would be reabsorbed then by the entity or person that created them. I would assume it's more of an entity in
Yeah.
Twin Peaks.
Yeah.
And so then whatever they're out there observing then gets reabsorbed and adds to the knowledge of the entity that created them.
Yeah, I mean they're really, it's like if you it's basically the like paranormal slash like supernatural like idea of like a security camera, and
Hmm.
then you review the footage. But it's a little creepy owl.
Mm-hmm.
Well, another straightforward area of comparison is a very fun one, I think, for all of us. And that's this concept of the weight of the etheric body. According to Dion Fortune, the weight of the etheric body is substantial, it's a lot. And so when the etheric body has been projected, the human body that remains, the physical body, is extremely lightweight, like
Mm-hmm.
the weight of a child.
Yeah.
And so we saw a really profound connection to
Yeah.
Twin Peaks with this, didn't we?
Yeah.
Absolutely. The creation of this, it's basically like made out of ectoplasm that I'm kind of equating with like electricity is all over this book.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And like the ectoplasm is kind of built from that, is my impression. And it's usually made for a purpose to like go somewhere, I think, in
Yeah.
this. But in Josie's case, it's like I don't know if she was drawn away, like if Thomas Eckhart's doing some kind of ritual. I mean, I know when I was covering those episodes in Blue Rose Task Force, I feel like they're leaving all kinds of room where he could also be connected to all this stuff too.
Yeah.
Where like, like
Definitely.
he's influenced by the Black Lodge in some way or another, which is how, Bob and the little man show up afterward. But I don't think Josie tried to make this ectoplasmic self or part of her that way, but because she was in that much of a state of fear, which
Hmm.
Cooper says
Yeah.
outright, that he blames it on, she died from fear. So like
Right.
if they say it, you kind of have to think of it textually,
Sure.
even when the evidence isn't all quite
Right.
uh, apparent. Um, but yeah, so if she's in a fear state, that means that like according to this book, like that self could be like severed from the solar plexus. Is that where they're
Hmm.
all these
Yeah.
forms are attached to? Um, yeah, like it seems like because she died while that form was in another frequency or realm or whatever you want to say, in the psychic realm, um, that's why she had her weight loss, because it
Hmm.
was it was elsewhere.
Right.
Yeah, because she weighs 65 pounds or something?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
Yeah,
something.
which would
Yeah.
definitely line up with what Fortune is saying,
Mm-hmm.
is left of the physical body when the etheric body is
Mm-hmm.
projected. And
Yeah.
then is it her etheric body that is absorbed into the drawer pull, right?
Hmm.
Is that what
Right.
happens? So I think, John, you put in our notes something that she's like the victim of a psychic attack here.
Yeah.
We're going to say she died of fear, or
Hmm.
Cooper says she dies of fear. We could definitely understand this as the victim of a psychic attack. She's severed from her
Yeah.
etheric self. The etheric self goes into the drawer pull and is trapped there,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
she's left weighing only 65
Yeah.
pounds.
Right.
Attacked
Yeah.
by fear.
Yeah. It actually lines up really neatly with this book.
Yes.
Right. And I think that that was something that we had sort of talked about, Hillary, when we sort of were just brainstorming, that there are a lot of things in this book that, like, so I think this is one of those, when it comes back to should you read the book or not, I think that, big fans of Twin Peaks might find it interesting, just like if you're already like a lover of reading and stuff, I think it's worth it, maybe because there are definitely things that are touched on in this book that I think sort of help elaborate on things that are common questions that fans have.
Hmm.
Like when fans are like, but why? I don't understand why that would be this or something, it's like I feel like this has some of those answers,
Yeah,
and this is one of
potentially.
those
Yeah.
examples. Yeah, potentially. Yeah.
Yeah. It, and that said, like, it kind of gets mixed and matched. It's like the concepts, like Frost will pull from King Arthur. He'll pull
Hmm.
from this. He'll pull from everything, and like he like takes his concepts, and instead of Black Lodge being like this Wyndham Early group, he
Yeah.
says let's nail it down on the supernatural stuff and like do some Jungian dreamscape with that. And like maybe he liked the idea of observers, but he doesn't want to put them in the way that Dion Fortune said, and like
Hmm.
Right.
and etheric bodies and like that would make sense to throw in. It's like it's interesting to see like the concepts in use by someone else, like just to
In
kind of get a better
creative
idea
use,
of what it
right?
is. Yeah.
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 Yeah, he like takes it as
Mm-hmm.
just the kind of germ of the idea and then
Yeah.
lets it kind of flower into something unique in Twin
Mm-hmm.
Peaks. Right, right.
Yeah. Or like each one is like a die that like you put in the Yahtzee cup, and then
Yeah.
like you
Mm.
shake it all out and see what rolls.
Definitely. Well, one of the things we thought was a straightforward topic, but the more we discussed it, actually realized this would be the first of our broader areas of analysis and discussion. This is on the role that food plays in psychic self-defense. So Dion Fortune says that there are some really practical things we can do to protect ourselves from psychic attacks. And one of them is by not going more than 2 hours without food.
So true.
Mm.
So, I mean, not only did I like this, and I think I'm just going to live by it from now on.
Yeah.
My goodness, does this help explain why everyone is eating all the time in Twin Peaks?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep, it explains the table full of donuts. It explains a lot of things.
The cherry pie. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there are particular symbols that I think,
Yep.
or images that fans will always associate. And I think like a lot of them are food stuff. It's like the donuts, the cherry pie, the
Mm-hmm.
coffee.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that, when it comes to food, also in Twin Peaks, we see it in particularly the areas of Twin Peaks that we see as kind of safe places. So, like the sheriff's department, we see all
Mm-hmm.
the donuts. They're
Yeah.
recharging for battle. Lucy's helping them recharge. We see it at the diner where a lot of
Yep.
tender moments take place. There's a lot of beautiful interactions there. Another thing that Hillary and I had sort of talked about, like, is this again, it started as like a tiny thing. And then the more we talked about it, we were like, oh my God, and then this and stuff. Well, the thing is that if we think about Laura, she like you have to also assume that she's doing a lot of cocaine, which completely suppresses your appetite. And she's like, another thing that I believe Fortune had said was like also about like alcohol consumption or like drugs and stuff can also muddle
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
And so it's like she's making herself so extremely vulnerable to these psychic attacks, and to any potential, she's making herself so vulnerable to that because she's not taking care of herself, and she's
Hmm.
not eating like she should be per se. And so it's also then interesting that she gets involved with the Meals on Wheels. She's
Mhm.
concerned about making sure that specifically it's the food from the diner, which again is that safe space. And she's bringing it to people that don't have a way to get there. She's
Yeah.
making sure that other people in Twin Peaks are eating and that they're safe and that
Yep.
they're taken care of. But she's not taking care of herself. She's making herself so vulnerable, but she's making sure to protect others, which is
Mhm.
really heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, Jennifer Lynch told Courtney Stallings in Laura's Ghost about how, if Laura was able to survive through it, she would be like this staunch advocate for everybody
Oh, yeah,
who's a victim of this stuff. And
absolutely.
instead, we get like after the "Who Are You Really" with her and Leland and Bob. Like the next morning, she like doesn't even finish her cereal, and
Yeah,
there's a coffee cup sitting right in front of her that she won't drink.
right.
Mhm. That's something that Indigo and I discussed too, that the meals at the Palmer House and Fire Walk with Me are not nourishing places. That's
Hmm.
not a chance to
No.
recharge and defend
Yeah,
yourself
yeah,
against psychic
that's
attack.
the place of battle.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah, I mean we
Mhm.
have the fingernail scene where he's holding her hands and like
Hmm.
she's not eating her meal. She's so
Yeah.
horrified. Like so she's not getting the nourishment that she needs to be able to protect herself potentially.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Obviously there's so many other things that go into protecting herself, but food really is a big part of it. It's like, she's not only making her body weaker by not getting enough sustenance and nutrition, but she's also adding in all of the alcohol and the drugs that are
Yeah.
also weakening her system. And I mean, like, even if we don't look at this through like a psychic attack, I would assume her health was probably just really bad.
Yeah.
But when we look at it through the lens of defense against psychic attacks, she's made herself a prime target because she doesn't have the ways to defend herself.
Yeah, and according to Dion Fortune, like there's three things that she specifically says are causes of psychic attacks, and one of them is drugs, one of
Uh-huh.
them is talismans, and one of them is magicians. And we know
Mhm.
Lynch talks about the word talisman, and we know
Yeah.
there are evil magicians and everything. Like I'm assuming Bob kind of qualifies in that sort of subcategory too
Yeah.
somehow. And like it's like one, two, three. She's got all of it.
Mhm.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, she's completely down for the count because she's got all of these things coming against her
Hmm.
and she's not protecting herself properly.
Well, it's funny that in contrast, in part 18 of The Return, when we're at Carrie Page's house, her house is littered with packaging from frozen dinners. And the way they're arranged, it looks as though someone tore open the box, opened the package, and just consumed it frozen, perhaps, and then just left everything in a pile. And there's like maybe 4 or 5
Yeah.
of these little piles of opened and discarded frozen dinners.
Yeah.
Um, one of the only things she says to Cooper as she's getting ready to leave is, "Listen, I don't have any food here." And Cooper says, "I'll get us some food on the way." But considering how little dialogue there is between them in part 18, the fact that she's emphasizing, "This is important. I don't have
Right.
any food
Right.
here." It's as if she innately knows, now this version of Laura
Right.
knows, I've got to be
Mhm.
ready to defend myself. And I know I sort of take, in the context of psychic self defense, those little piles of discarded refuse from these dinners as almost eaten in desperation,
Oh,
right?
definitely.
Like the attack is coming, so just got
Right.
to wolf
Mhm.
something down right now,
Yeah.
every 2 hours.
Well,
Mhm.
and if you think of something like very cheap and easy, like to eat, you know,
Mhm.
it's not like she has the time to sit and cook a fancy meal. She's like, I have to get food in me immediately.
Yeah.
Something is coming. I have to, you know, get my energy up. I have to be able to protect myself. She seems to recognize the urgency of what's to come and also how to defend herself.
I also like it in terms of the log lady's compulsive
Mhm.
munching on peanuts.
Yeah.
Um, so, like in the scene at the roadhouse where she says, there are owls at the roadhouse, and goes there with Cooper, and he sees the giant. This is as
Yeah.
Maddie is being killed.
Yeah.
She is just chowing down on those peanuts, you
Right.
know, and it is actually quite funny. But if anybody would know how to defend herself against psychic attack, it would be Margaret.
Right.
So maybe that compulsive munching on peanuts wasn't just for comic relief there. Maybe it's also her doing what she needs to do to
Well,
I
and
defend
that's
believe
herself.
it.
yeah, and that's another thing where it's like the TV dinners where that's something that you can just get in you quickly. It's going to give you
Mhm.
protein, it's going to give you you know, it's going to fill you up quickly, and when you need to prepare urgently for a psychic attack, that'll do the trick
Yeah.
in a
Mhm.
pinch.
Roadhouse peanuts.
Yeah. It's like the same thing as bringing, like, trail mix on a hike or keeping it in your bag. It's like, I gotta get food in me fast. I gotta get some protein. Let's go.
Mhm.
Even in part 2 of The Return, when she's on the phone with Hawk and he's out in the woods, it's when
Yeah,
he sees the curtains appear in
right.
Glastonbury Grove. She says, I'll have pie and coffee waiting for you here."
Right.
Like, she's
Mhm.
letting Hawk know, "I've got your defense ready."
Yeah.
Right. Like, come here, recharge for the
Mhm.
battle
Mhm.
ahead.
Becky Briggs too. She gets a call and like she talks
Yeah.
with Shelley over the phone, and but yeah, instead of Steven and Gersten getting lost in the woods, it's like we have Shelley basically inviting Becky over for I don't remember if it was coffee or whatever, but it was definitely something about food and like um, food and gathering the gathering around the table, the conversation is lively. I'm
Mhm.
paraphrasing that quote, but it's like the food is good preparation, but the food also signifies togetherness.
Mhm. Yeah,
Right.
it's Shelley tells Becky to come to the diner and get a piece of pie with ice cream and whipped cream, I think.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And
Yeah.
and Shelley says, "Oh," or Becky says, "Oh, that sounds so good."
Hmm.
And I think that's the last time we see Becky
Yeah, that's the last time
in
we
The
hear her
Return.
for sure.
Yeah, so there's Shelley offering
Hmm.
her that
Yeah.
that defense that she
Yep.
needs for sure.
Yep. She heads in the positive direction and stays in the story.
Do you think that this could also possibly explain why Jack is shoveling down that spaghetti, in the diner scene
Oh,
with Ray and Daria and Mr. C? Remember? And they tease him about,
Hmm.
like, eating 2
maybe,
dinners?
yeah.
Like, maybe Jack
He's
has a sense
trying. He's like, "Oh god, I have
Yeah,
to
he
try
he
to get
knows
this
he's in
in."
the target.
Right.
maybe subconsciously,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you could
W
feel the energy going in the wrong direction for him.
Right.
What I like about this topic so much, though, is I think often we talk about the coffee and cherry pie and donut side of Twin Peaks as distinct from the more supernatural aspects of it, and I love having this link between the two.
Right.
Hmm.
They're not separate stories, right? The
Yeah.
the the coffee cherry pie side, that's all part of defending
Mhm.
ourselves against the darkness that's out there in the woods. So it's all part of the same story. A quote I really loved from Dion Fortune about this was, "If the victim of a cult attack concentrates on mundane things, he is a heartbreaking proposition for any sorcerer." what is the sorcerer to do if at the time when he is operating the black art, his victim is at the local cinema roaring at the antics of Charlie Chaplin? So if we're having fun, if we're concentrating on mundane things, if we're enjoying our pie and coffee and whatever else,
Mhm.
we are a heartbreaking proposition for the black magician.
Mhm.
Well, and it's like we've kind of talked about that in past episodes too, where it's like people that are focusing on, like finding their path or their joy, they seem to be in sort of better standing than those that aren't. Like the people that have like found their dharma and stuff like that. It's
Mhm.
like,
Mhm.
you know, they seem safer from the darkness.
Well, there's also like with the watching Charlie Chaplin thing, like there was this nugget further in the book somewhere where like if you don't react to the attack,
Mm,
it turns away from the person getting attacked and it returns back on the attacker. So like
Yes.
yeah.
you almost have to know it's there and then you have to choose it, like and
Mhm.
this gets into all the jade ring stuff with me. Like
Mm,
it's like there's always a choice, it's like you can choose not to take it or you can choose to take it for a positive reason or a negative reason.
Mhm.
And like there's all this nuance that like just the that concept just triggered it for me. And like you get people choosing, like Josie, it's like she gets attacked, she chooses to go with the fear side of things and she ends up losing her etheric body. And then you have Cooper choosing to give his soul to Bob to save Annie, and like he's choosing it for a positive reason of love
yeah.
Mhm.
for Annie, and like he gets screwed too because he chose something. It's like he chose to acknowledge the attack and then like he took it on. Like it doesn't matter if it's a good reason or a bad reason why you're doing it, but if you accept the attack, you accept the damage.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, she emphasizes that there are 2 gates that the attacker can enter the soul, and that's self-preservation or sex instinct. So it's fear and love,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Those are the
Yep.
things that open the door.
Yep.
But it's the door to your aura, and it's pierced from the inside. So to
Hmm.
go with what you're saying, John, is that she says that the aura is always pierced from within by the response of fear or desire going out toward the attacking entity. So in Twin Peaks, we have that language that seems to be about like the opening of the red room, right? The fear or love open the door. But in Dion Fortune's paradigm here, it's fear and love open the door to our souls
Hmm.
when we respond with one or the other to the attack. So it's we open from within and allow the attack to come
Hmm.
to us.
Yeah.
Well, and since we've already started talking about this, we might as well move right into this topic of hypnotic domination by an astral entity, which is a big part of psychic self defense, and I think quite obviously a big part of Twin Peaks, too. One thing that really struck me about what Fortune's describing of being attacked by one of these astral entities and kind of hypnotized by them is that the hypnotic suggestion has to harmonize with the bias of the personality of the person being attacked. If it doesn't, then any attempt to have this effect will fall apart, right? It won't find a root in the person.
Hmm.
Fortune says all the suggestionists can really do is reinforce and stimulate the ideas and impulses that are already there,
Mm,
though perhaps latent. So she's saying that a hypnotic suggestionist who's trying to psychically attack through an astral entity that has to resonate with something within the person that's there already. So if
Hmm.
I thought about that in terms of like Leland and Bob,
yeah.
Yeah.
that would suggest to me that Bob is only able to have possession of Leland because there is something in Leland that Bob connects with, that is like Bob. That,
Right.
that seems what she's implying, or she would be implying through something like this.
Right. And like I think that that is something that in terms of how I kind of said earlier, that this book can sort of address things that are big discussions between fans is Leland bad or is it just Bob? And
Mhm.
it's like this would, sort of indicate that perhaps it's already a part of Leland. There is already
Mhm.
this darkness within him that he could have been capable of this. I mean, unfortunately, let's be real. This happens all the time in real life without Bob's.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And especially because he says that Bob came to him so early in life. It's like,
Mhm.
what did you do or think that drew this entity to you? Like what did you, like what within you, what level of darkness attracted something like this to you and
Mhm.
welcomed it in? It's really interesting. But it's like I think that we see enough times where it really is hard to tell the line between what's Leland, what's Bob. There's a lot of
Yeah.
scenes where it's a little bit hard to tell. It really is like at times it can be uncertain, but I think that this might give us a bit of an answer, or at least a jumping off point.
Now Bob's complicated because it's not. We kind of started with like the hypnotism angle of approach to Leland, but
Mm.
um, there's also the vampire part of this. The
Mhm.
psychic
Mhm.
vampires, and I mean that per Mark Frost. I mean they're basically one and the same. Psychic vampire Bob. Like he
Mm.
in Twin Peaks Behind the Scenes by Mark Altman, um, Frost basically says there's a certain classic type of vampire myth that comes into play when a soul that invites something into it to take part in its life cannot then refuse it anything. That's a myth that goes way back before pre-Christian times, and that's one possible explanation. I mean, then he follows it up. The other is that Leland is just completely whacked out of his mind. That
Mhm.
closes the
Mhm.
quote. But yeah, it's like I kind of feel like we're going to talk about elementals in this book because I think
Mhm.
Frost also kind of sees Bob as like one of these kind of forces that's basically made out of
Mhm.
one single element, which is
Mm.
kind of like out of out of balance with us who would come with four elements. We have all the earth, fire, air, water. Um, but like when one of them like comes into our planet, like that, it's just like a balance issue. And
Mhm.
if Bob is kind of like a psychic vampire like that, or if he's like an element of idea, it's like what that idea is appetite.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
he amplifies because he's only made out of one element. He basically puts that out of whack with whoever he's talking to, which is why, with Leland, it's kind of, song and dance, and like, he kills with his hands and he's obsessed with fingernails and things like
Mhm.
that. Because, a little boy would be obsessed about, being, not clean enough to go to eat dinner
Mm.
and whatnot. And, like just, but then when Bob is in Mr. C, he's a sharpshooter.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So like, Bob just amplifies the want.
Yeah.
It's like whatever the want is by whoever invited him in and let him stay.
Unfortunately, Fortune doesn't spend a lot of time on the psychic vampire in this text.
Yeah.
She tells a couple of anecdotes that aren't that interesting, right? About
Yeah.
people who she suspects were victims of vampirism, but it isn't a major point in the text. Even in the
No.
chapter on vampirism, she spends very little time
It's
actually
a
discussing
pretty
it.
short section in general.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Where in contrast, she spends a lot of time talking about this hypnotic domination by an astral entity, which almost is similar, right? In
Hmm.
practice, it feels quite similar to what's being described here by Mark Frost in a sense as the psychic vampire.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This
It's
this
almost
other
like the technique of the psychic vampire.
yes, that's the
Yeah.
technique. Mhm. I think an important part, though, about that relationship between the psychic vampire or the astral entity that's dominating the human actor is that it's a relationship that seems to go both ways, as opposed to the person is the victim and that this entity is the kind of evil attacker. So to go back to that kind of mixed culpability of Leland, or debated culpability of Leland, when she's describing how this attack might happen, she says that the person creates an atmosphere within his own consciousness while he thinks of the victim. If he wants to perform a psychic murder, he must fill his soul with the rage of destruction until it overflows. If he wants to perform a psychic rape, he must fill his soul with lust and cruelty. Now, what happens when he does this? He has sounded a ringing keynote in the abyss. It will be answered. All beings who have this keynote for the basis of their nature will respond and will join the operation. But they do not operate direct upon the victim, they work through the operator. So, in that context, the operator would be Leland, right? He's
Mm-hmm.
performing, in this sense, rape and murder on
Yeah.
multiple victims. Yeah, he's calling on, in a sense, these other entities, but they're working through him. To me, that lends a little bit of context on that relationship, perhaps between Bob and Leland, also.
Right. And I think that that was like when we had first talked about that quote in particular, it was like, what did he do to like ring that bell then?
Mm-hmm.
You know, like what did he do that would send out that calling to draw Bob is concerning, if that's the case.
Now, I know this isn't going to be a big topic, but you talking about bells, like there was
Mm.
this almost throwaway idea about astral
Yes.
bells.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like that they alert of things that, like, of the attacks basically, and like all I can think of is part 8 of The Return, where there's this giant bell
Mm-hmm.
ringing
Mm-hmm.
and the fireman turns it off, and that's when we see whatever the experiment is, you know, frog spawn spewing
Mm-hmm.
onto the earth from wherever, and we see the bob orb kind of going along with it.
Mm-hmm.
So like that almost has to be like Frost repurposing an astral bell, right?
Definitely. It's
Yeah.
even bell shaped.
Yeah.
The astral bell can also be the presence of a positive entity. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
always have to be a negative one. And so that's perhaps one explanation for the sound in the Great Northern as well,
Yeah.
Mm.
where uh,
Mm-hmm.
where Ben Horn and Beverly are hearing that, and Beverly even says it sounds like a temple bell.
Mm-hmm.
So the veil has been torn there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps, and this astral bell could be what's coming through there.
Yeah. And I suspect Lynch probably gets that from his Buddhism rather than the Dion
Mm-hmm.
Fortune book, but like,
Oh,
they definitely come from similar sources.
Hmm.
right. I mean, I think that's the other thing with this book in general is that a lot of these ideas overlap with different belief systems and
Mm-hmm.
different cultures. So a lot of these topics that she brings up are things that you could find in other sources as well.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Another area that we kind of similar with the food one we got a little excited about that I think this was another one that started off small and then when we had our little brainstorming meeting it kind of got a little bit bigger was um Another thing that Fortune talks about is what she calls astral Siamese twins. So she says that rapport forms the basic condition necessary for telepathic suggestion to take place. Two people who are in rapport might be described as astral Siamese twins. Although the physical bodies are independent units, the astral bodies are linked in such a manner that there is free circulation of astral force between them, just as the circulatory system of the mother is connected through the umbilical cord with the unborn child. Um, and then she also talks about that rapport once established, uh, actual ideas can be transferred from one mind to to another, as in telepathy. And in the same way, vital force can be transmitted. When etheric vitality is being transmitted, it is necessary that the persons concerned should be within the immediate magnetic field of each other. But when astral force is in question, this is not necessary. Transmission is independent of space. So we saw a big connection of this with Laura and Maddie, because so already they look obviously identical because it's the same actress. Um, but if you also tie in the secret diary and like the discussions of Maddie and Laura, they Maddie talks about having dreams about Laura being in danger. They seem to have this connection that could be along the lines of these astral Siamese twins. And then when she comes to Twin Peaks, she kind of fills this void that Laura left behind. But what is interesting is that Fortune says when two human beings are in rapport, the less positive of the two tends to lose his own individuality and becomes a pale reflection of the other. And so when comes in to Twin Peaks, she is a pale reflection of Laura. They even dress her up as Laura. They use her to fill the space that Laura left behind, but she's not Laura. She doesn't fill the void as much as maybe they would hope that she could. But she fits in the spaces where James is drawn to her, and we've got Donna being jealous of her. But when Maddie dies, they're not devastated in the way that they were when Laura died. It's like Maddie disappears, and it's not Donna crying in the classroom. They don't have the
Mm-hmm.
huge reaction that they do when we have Laura's death. But it's also interesting because if we think about them being connected as astral Siamese twins, um, then Leland Bob killing her, is that an act of finishing off the job?
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, so you got Laura, but you didn't really get all of her because part of her is left behind in Maddie because of
Mm-hmm.
this connection that they've built. And so is this you having to finish the job? There was still like a shard of her soul
Mm-hmm.
left on the physical plane, so you have to take it out. And is that why there is this extreme violence towards her in the end?
I love all of that.
Well, I really love that too, because I do think that Maddie tends to be a confounding character.
Mm-hmm.
And this helps not only explain why she falls right into Laura's place
Right.
when she arrived. It couldn't just be explained by grief and missing her, because
Right.
the connection that James
Mm-hmm.
has to her is so intense, and Donna, and
Mm-hmm.
then she's dressed up as Laura.
Yep.
Um, and Indigo, when you said that Leland Bob has to finish the job,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
it's cleaning up the last psychic traces of Laura that are
Mm-hmm.
left in this plane.
Yeah, because they're like, okay, I did it, and then Maddie shows up, and they're like, no, we missed a
Mhm.
spot,
Mhm.
and they have to
Hmm.
rub out that spot.
Mhm.
Yeah, that tracks with a lot of things. Like after Laura had her abortion in the diary,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's like Sarah basically gets incredibly jealous of the
Mm-hmm.
phone because Maddie calls immediately knowing that
Yeah.
she needs to be there. And yeah, like you're absolutely right. And it's like, what does Donna get upset about? She, um, James just gets all focused on, like, it's like us, everything's bad, like nothing works, and then like he leaves town. But it's more focused on like his and Donna's relationship.
Yeah,
It's almost like that got taken out with the bathwater too, when
right.
Maddie died.
Yeah.
What about Mr. C and Dougie?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Do you see them as astral Siamese twins as well, potentially?
yeah, although that one's more complicated because I think that has to do with elementals and entities and like the terms that we're probably going to get to next.
Well, we could talk about artificial elementals, and then we could decide if we think that
Mm-hmm.
they're astral Siamese twins or artificial elementals. So, our last major topic for today is what Fortune calls the artificial elemental. Now, she distinguishes these from something called thought forms. In theosophy, there's this idea that by concentrated thought, you can create entities, sometimes accidentally, sometimes on purpose. So if you have a lot of hatred or anger, that will create thought forms
Mhm.
that then have a presence of their own and then can kind of impact things. Now, an artificial elemental is distinct from a thought form in that once it's formulated by the creative mind of the magician, according to Fortune, it possesses a distinct and independent life of its own. So it becomes a separate entity with its own life. An artificial elemental does. In my reading, that sounds a lot like what Twin Peaks calls a tulpa.
Mhm.
So she describes that the life of these creatures is akin to that of an electric battery. It slowly leaks out by means of radiation, and unless recharged periodically, will finally weaken and die out. So, John, you noted something about Dougie going on his 3-day benders as
Mhm.
perhaps related to this.
Yeah, well, I mean, assuming assuming that Bob's somehow using appetite as like part of its energy accumulation, let's say, um, that would kind of explain why we see Dougie with Jade. It's like there's an appetite for that sort of thing. um it's not just food, it's just every kind of appetite. And it's
Mhm.
like he misses his kid's birthday party because of it. He gambles. He it's like more money, even though it ends up usually getting him less money because he keeps eating and eating and doing it until it's too much. It's that being out of balance thing again. But
Mhm.
it's like he goes away from his family and misses important things because he's just too hungry for the pleasures.
Mhm. And is that one way of thinking about this recharge
Yeah,
that
like you have to
Mhm.
recharge on the pleasures if if your co-parent is Bob.
Right. Well, I was thinking about that in terms of Diane's tulpa and the compulsive drinking. We
Mm-hmm.
never really see the
Yeah,
Diane tulpa without tiny bottles of
yeah,
alcohol or
Yeah.
yeah, or
drinks.
cigarettes, or
Right.
or
Um
what, Don Johnson's kid. I don't even think that guy had a name. The
Mhm.
Sure. So although Diane is a much more likable character than Dougie, the Dougie Tulpa, um, seems to have been. I don't mean Dougie Cooper,
Yeah.
um, but she also might be the kind of recharging this artificial elemental battery by
Mm-hmm.
constant use of alcohol,
Yeah.
cigarettes, and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If these tulpas are created by the negative side,
Hmm.
it's like you have to have the negative fuel,
Hmm.
because otherwise the
Mhm.
electric battery is flowing the wrong direction. It'd be like you're the battery set for American electricity, but you end up getting Europe's electricity instead, and yeah,
You blow out your hair dryer.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Just things go wrong.
Yeah, even the creation of these artificial elementals rings a little true to Twin Peaks,
Hmm.
especially in The Return, because Fortune says that they're created by, quote, forming a clear cut image in the imagination of the creature, ensouling it with something of the corresponding
Hmm.
aspect of one's own being, then invoking the natural force,
Yeah.
which of course would be electricity.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
when we see Cooper take a little piece of his
Yep.
hair,
Yep.
give it to Philip Gerard, who puts it with that little gold ball,
Yeah.
says electricity. I mean, that seems to come right from psychic self
Yeah.
defense in this
Hmm.
sense.
Now, the complicated part for me is that this concept that we're talking about, where like, you're manifesting something from inside yourself,
Mm-hmm.
like that in this book is basically saying that's how you can manifest guardian angels,
Hmm.
which, yeah, I mean, anybody, anybody who's watched Fire Walk with me, like that makes you kind of question. I mean, sure. Lynch has his own faith and everything, so it's probably not exactly this. But if it's one for one with the concepts of this book, does that mean that Laura created her own angels? Or, does that mean that there's no like angel, God kind of higher power coming to help save her? Or is she doing it herself? Like, there's a whole bunch of nuance here that
Mm-hmm.
is really, really tough to answer. And I mean, we can't, but we got to try, right?
It is really neat, though, because this idea that we can create a kind of artificial elemental for good, too. And that Fortune says this is, she, in her opinion, this is where guardian angels come from, is that we do create them for ourselves. And although I guess you're right. We don't know really what the source is. The net impact is the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it comes from a God figure or it comes from within Laura's own power, it's
Mm-hmm.
still a source of incredible comfort and peace and safety. So um, maybe in that sense it doesn't matter if she does, but I get what you mean. It's hard to answer that question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fortune says on the angels that it's equally in times of dire stress when we have our back to the wall and we are fighting for more than our physical lives. Another voice makes itself heard, the voice of the bright angel. I have never known this to occur when a man was fighting simply for his physical life, but in times of spiritual crisis, when the very self is being swept away. Then it is the cry of the soul that is heard, and something manifests out of the mists of the unseen, manifests in the form that is comprehensible to the one who calls. That really describes the situation that Laura's in at the end of
Yeah.
Fire Walk with Me. It
Yeah.
isn't just her physical death, it is her very self that
Mm-hmm.
could be swept away, and that something, capital S something, comes out of the unseen and manifests in a form that is recognizable to her. Well, that's the image of that angel in that painting that she has been concentrating on in her room, looking at so intently as a source of comfort or safety. And then, of course, it disappears on her. So it makes sense that the angel mimics that form when it appears in the
Yeah.
train car. Yeah.
Well, and something else that we had talked about was that Fortune also says it is said that dying women, anxious concerning the welfare of their children, frequently form them unconsciously, talking about guardian angels. And so obviously Laura's not, a mother that's dying and leaving behind a child, but she is a woman who's under this extreme distress, and putting out all of that psychic energy, um, and power that could create something. And so it's, if it can happen to other, especially like other women dying in dire circumstances, I think that it makes sense that Laura would do that. And I think something we had talked about was how Laura is so adamant about protecting the people around her. And
Hmm.
so if she's putting out that energy, it may not even be directly to protect herself, because obviously in those circumstances where the mothers are passing and they're looking to create a guardian angel for their children to protect them, then Laura is leaving. She's perhaps accepted her fate, but she wants to use that psychic energy to manifest something that can protect also the other people around her or the people she cares about. um,
And in that case, it's Ronette.
yeah.
So, after reading this bit about artificial elementals and the angel, we are left with the question of, did Laura manifest something else, perhaps, too, besides a guardian angel?
Right. And well, again, so if we're thinking along the lines of, so she's a young woman in trouble, and she, again, she's producing this incredible amount of psychic energy because of her extreme distress. She's looking to manifest something to protect the people around her. Because again, Laura was always looking out for other people rather than herself. Um, and what would a teenage girl manifest that could protect other women like her, like her other friends that are her age? She doesn't know that when she dies, if Bob is going to go after other people. She doesn't know what's going to happen when she's gone. And so wouldn't she want to create a protector, something to protect Donna, something to protect Audrey, something that would protect Twin Peaks? And could it be that she creates a white knight who's handsome and charming and kind, but would never prey upon teenage girls the way that all the other men in her life have? He's in a position where he can do good and actually fix this. And
And if you haven't figured it out, I think Indigo's talking about Cooper.
yeah. I was trying to make it as drawn out as possible. But yeah, so what if she had not only created a guardian angel in the form of an angel, but also a guardian angel in the form of Dale Cooper to protect her friends, to protect Twin Peaks and stop Bob? Because she can't anymore. She's
Yeah.
leaving. She knows that she's leaving and that she can't stop him anymore on the physical plane, from hurting those around her. And what if, again, she's also like, it's not just that she is a dying woman, so she's putting out this, again, like, incredible physical or incredible psychic energy, but also like the way that Bob wants her so much. We see that Laura's got this like real strength to her. She's got a lot of power whether she realizes it or not. And I think that she has the power that if she wanted to create two guardian angels, she absolutely could.
Yeah, I think that can work out pretty well. Yeah, I mean, and especially if you tag it in with the "Is Laura the Dreamer" kind of
Yeah.
thing, because I mean, it's all there. I know I talked about it a lot on my Fire Walk with Me coverage, the episode "We Live Inside a Dream,"
Mhm.
and I mean, I basically, I mean, I don't necessarily buy that because I tend to think that the supernatural kind of taps people who are already here to kind of do the job that's needed as needed. But I think I think in general, I'm gonna do a yes and
Mhm.
with what you were saying about Maddie. It's like,
Mhm.
Bob killing Maddie was finishing the job. Cooper arresting Bob and getting him out of Leland and getting him out of the world is finishing the job.
Mhm.
Mm.
Like there's a good balance to that totally tracks.
I think in the original series, the idea of Laura having manifested Cooper, right, that he's an artificial elemental, wouldn't really make a lot of sense because I don't think that was anywhere near the intention there.
Hmm.
In Fire Walk with Me, though, where Laura is centered, and Cooper is a strange character in
Mm-hmm.
Fire Walk with Me.
Yeah.
I think that that possibility starts to emerge a little bit more. Even the fact that they have a clear psychic connection
Mhm.
as he's talking with Albert,
Yeah.
and describing
Mm-hmm.
Laura, and she's preparing a large quantity of food or
Yeah.
something. And
Yep. Again,
um,
food protection.
Mhm.
right. And that he's there in the red room with her, with the angel,
Mm-hmm.
also obviously a comforting presence.
Yeah.
But then definitely in the return, with his absolute single minded, even reckless determination to go back in time to get Lara, to bring
Mm-hmm.
her back. In another theosophical text, it's Annie Besant's The Ancient Wisdom, which Dion Fortune herself read. She says this: it is characteristic of these artificial elementals, when they are directed by the will toward any particular person, that they are animated by the one impulse of carrying out the will of the Creator. A protective elemental will hover round its object, seeking any opportunity of warding off evil or attracting good, not consciously, but by blind impulse, as finding there the line of least resistance,
Mm-hmm.
as if an artificial elemental created for the purposes of protection can do nothing else. Now, again, that's not from Dion Fortune, that's from a text that would have informed Dion Fortune.
Yeah.
Um, but it's interesting to think about these artificial elementals almost acting the way that a golem does. That it
Mm-hmm.
has this single purpose, that it
Yeah.
will follow through. In this case, a protective and
Mm-hmm.
positive one. But
Mhm.
yeah,
Even after it takes on a life of its own, like she
yes.
says that these kind of elementals can do.
Indigo, when we were talking about this a couple of days ago, you mentioned how Cooper's, even in the original series, Cooper's affinity for Twin Peaks is so immediate and so
Mhm.
all-consuming. It's like he was created
Yeah,
to be there.
yeah, he was created to like love Twin Peaks because from the get go, he's completely smitten with it. Every little detail. And also, he assimilates so quickly and so well. Like, no one is like, I don't know, like thrown off by his appearance, really. Like, he's very quickly welcomed in as a part of Twin Peaks. And he wants to be too. Like, he very quickly kind of settles in with the townspeople. He loves it as a physical space as well, and so it seems as if, again, like as if he could have been created to love and protect Twin Peaks by someone who loved Twin Peaks and wanted to protect it.
I could buy that. Yeah, that's tough though, because there's also that whole thing about like him becoming a Bob host. It's like
Hmm.
once you're in the red room, you're always in the red room. Once you become a Bob host, you've always got that mark.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
And like, he comes there with an appetite for it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, like I don't know. Like how much of that is just the fact that he'd already been targeted by Bob to be the next host or, like a potential
Right.
host.
Hmm.
Sure. So his attraction to Twin
So
Peaks is that psychic connection
yeah.
from Bob.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So like, yeah, maybe he's being like hypnotized by a psychic
Sure.
vampire.
Yeah.
But if we want to keep Indigo's idea that like Laura has brought him here, Bob can't get
Mm-hmm.
Laura, so he's going to take the next best thing. He'll take the
Mm-hmm.
entity
Yeah.
that Laura
Yeah.
created for protection of herself
Yeah.
and Twin
Yep.
Peaks. So,
More unfinished
yeah.
business.
Yeah.
So, we're going to wrap up our discussion of psychic self defense. But before we do, I feel the need to say something to John because it's our show and I'm editing it and he can't cut this out. That back when I was just listening to podcasts and lurking on social media and was too shy even to enter into online conversations about Twin Peaks, I was such a fan of John's show, and I very hesitantly and with a pounding heart sent a private message on Twitter just saying like, "Hey, I really like your podcast. Thank you." And John responded right away and so kindly and warmly and said, "Do you have any theories about Twin Peaks?" And in fact, I did have theories. And but just the fact that you asked and have opened that door and let a new fan come in made such an impact on me. And then
Oh,
tentatively, I started kind of, maybe joining the Discord book discussion on Dale Cooper's
mhm,
autobiography or
yep,
um, just other little connections. And you were the first person who we reached out to about this podcast too and got advice. And
yeah.
it would not exist without you. You really represent the best of Twin Peaks fandom. Your kindness, your warmth, your openness, your generosity, your friendship has just meant the world to me and to Indigo and to this podcast. So you've taken this incredibly introverted, shy fan who was content to just quietly listen on the side and now, we're doing this. So thank you so much for being here today, but also for everything else. Your encouragement, your friendship. It's made such a difference. Thank you.
Well, well, of course. I mean, aw. Being in the Twin Peaks fandom, like you just got to pay it forward. And I mean, I did the same. I was you talking to Sparkwood and 21 podcast, and like it's just a thing we do. I mean, I don't know if it started from like John Thorne and Craig Miller on Wrapped in Plastic or what, but like the ethos has always been like, pay it forward and give back and like just, I mean, sure, there's bad eggs or whatever, but like in the grand scheme of things, I mean, that Twin Peaks is way too existential to be like super gatekeepy about
Mhm.
it and everything. And like, it's like it's about like learning about yourself just as much as it is learning about like what the hell's going on in this show.
For sure.
So
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just happy for you because like I knew you had stuff in there that needed to come out, and I mean the proof is in the pudding. I mean your show is amazing. Like I love pretty much everything about this. I mean like I'm never gonna forget when you two came up with the idea that Laura's not a Dorothy, she's an Alice. Just things
Mhm.
like that. Like that, yeah. This show is like one of my favorites, and like more than one of your episodes are like in my top favorite things that I listen to, probably in
Ugh,
podcasts. So,
don't even know what to say to that. I'm speechless. But
oh,
thank you.
Well, and to chime in, I feel like whenever Hillary first approached me about if I would be interested in doing the podcast, because up until then we had just both been friends and fans.
mhm.
Um, your name was like the first one to come up, that when
Oh,
I expressed like any nervousness or anything, um I was like, oh, but will people like us, or will they be really mean? And she was like, no, 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 there are so many kind people, and John is so wonderful and has made me certain that like we can do this and that people will be kind, because there are people like John out there, that will like look out for us and you know give us advice and be our friend. um, and I'm just so glad that we could meet at all, and especially that it's through something as wonderful as Twin Peaks and David Lynch. And yeah, just to chime in, it's just we're so incredibly grateful for all of your friendship and kindness.
Well, for our next episode coming out in March, we owe a thank you to Stephen Miller on the Twin Peaks blog, who just last month in
Mhm.
January published an article where he had extensively researched a book that Laura Palmer is holding and reading in Fire Walk with Me. It ends up that it's a story called The Rose and the Ring. Also in Fire Walk with Me, Laura is carrying a copy of The Human Comedy. So I guess next month we're kind of doing a Fire Walk with Me book club. And we're going to be talking about Laura's books, The Rose and the Ring and The Human Comedy.
And that episode is kind of going to go hand in hand with the fact that next month at Row House, we will be introing a movie again. They are doing a David Lynch week in memoriam, and we are going to be there on the 29th. So this is March 29th at 6 p.m. for a showing of Fire Walk with Me, and we'll be introing the film, and I'm sure we'll have some really good nuggets to pull from that episode to share there as well. Also, if you want to get in touch with us in the meantime, you can always shoot us an email at fullblossomoftheeveningpodcast@gmail.com. And then if you want to follow us or message us on Instagram, you can find us at Full Blossom of the Evening on Instagram. Same thing. We'd love to see your messages and your comments with any ideas you have.
Well, thank you for listening to The Full Blossom of the Evening.
And we're going to sign off with It Was Laura, and she's come to kiss you goodbye.
Goodbye, listeners.
Goodbye.
It was Laura. And I saw her glowing. I saw her